I want to welcome you to the Wisdom series that we're doing on Sunday mornings. This is a special one insofar as I'm actually speaking at the Cove, the Billy Graham Conference Center, on this Sunday. So I'm pre-recording this program rather than putting it on the Zoom format. We'll be back to the live study next week. But meanwhile, though, let's pick up where we left off. We've been doing a series on wisdom, as we've known, and on the website here, you can see this wisdom series when you go to the homepage, kenboa.org. And if you just hover over the weekly studies here, you'll see then here's the Sunday morning class, and so we are here. So we've been looking at Job, and previously we were looking at learning from adversity and who can answer why, the fundamental questions that are associated with this book. And so we are just kind of continuing in our journey in this book and understanding what's really, what it's truly about in terms of an understanding, a perspective, a point of view of how do we grasp true wisdom in this world. We did an overview of wisdom already, as we can see, and they're all available on the website in any one of these series. And we then did a sub-series on overview of Proverbs. Now we're up to Job. We're going to be looking at the Wisdom Psalms, Ecclesiastes, New Testament, and then kind of tying it together in terms of what it means to have a life of truth, goodness, and beauty in this world. And so turning back to Job then, we've seen then a fundamental or simple overview is the idea of the conflict followed by in heaven and earth in that prologue, and then in the dialogue, and then the epilogue. There's another conflict on the horizontal level, the understandings, where people are trying to reason off and understand the ways of God. And then in the epilogue, God is the one who actually breaks the silence and reveals himself in a way that Job had not previously known or seen, and Job humbles himself before him. And so as we saw this material then, we were looking at this, the dilemma of Job in the first part, and this is an outline from my talk through the Bible book, where we synthesize each book of the Bible. And this particular component then, as we're looking at, we saw the circumstances of Job in the first chapter, and then the first and then second assaults of Satan, the arrival of Job's friends in chapter 2, and then we began the first cycle of debate, which really is chapters 3 through 14. And we saw Job's first speech, and then Eliphaz, and then Job's reply to Eliphaz, and then Bildad's first speech. And so we see these cycles that are going on. And then we saw Job's response to Bildad. Job argues his case, and there's a disproportionate amount of material that focuses on Job and his point of view relative to his those who are his interlocutors and those who are questioning his integrity, and assuming perhaps that it must be because of something that Job has done that he's suffering so much. He gives a lengthy speech in chapter 11, and then his response, Zophar gives a speech in chapter 11, then Job's lengthy response in chapters 12 to 14. Only God knows. He begs God to speak to him, and he warns that we only have this one life. So that's where we've been then. That's where we've gone in our journey. And just to give a point of view or perspective of this, let's go back to this overview from the keynote presentation I've done in the book of Job. And again, to see where we were there, this transforming crisis that takes place in the life of a great man, in which he loses all things and forces him to wrestle with the fundamental question that all of us must wrestle with, the question of why would God allow such things to occur. And so what we see in this context then is that we have this sequence in which you have a heavenly debate between God and Satan, which moves then into an earthly debate between Job and his friends, and then closes with a series of divine questions. So then we see that Job's trust in God changes. At first, we see a strong growth, and then growing complaining and self-righteousness, followed by a point of repentance after God manifests himself to Job. And then this is followed by a restoration. We'll discuss that context when we get to that. But in looking at this then, we see that the fundamental motif in this book is that trials bring about transformation, inevitably. The man after the process is different from the man before the process. It's an inevitability. And so in our talk through the book of Job, then we looked at the dilemma, the debates, and the deliverance of Job as the three major motifs. And in doing so then, we saw the controversy between God and Satan. And then we began to look at the first cycle of debate as we explored that. So let me again review where we are on all of this. So with the first cycle of debate then, what we see is it concludes with Job's response in these various chapters, in chapters 12 and following. So just again to summarize where we are, go back to Job. In Job chapter 12, then, here's where he chides his accusers, as we see. And then we went through this material in our last time together, and we explored some of the key motifs that are involved in Job's reflections and processing. And particularly here, he asks these fundamental questions in chapter 14. Let's just jump ahead to that. Again, we're being highly selective. Again, this is just a high overview and pulling out a few key verses. This well-known summary, man who is born of woman is short-lived and full of turmoil. There's the condition, the summary of the human condition in a nutshell. We live briefly, and our lives, even in that brief sojourn, are full of turmoil, uncertainty. We're roiling in the quest for meaning and purpose and hope and something substantive that we can lay hold of. And yet the brevity is like that of the pathos of a flower. We come forth, we wither. And so we flee like a shadow, we don't remain. And so this idea of God being overwhelming to Job and ultimately bringing him into judgment with himself. But then Job makes this other important statement, and this is one of the great questions that one could ever ask. If a man dies, will he live again? This is a fundamental question that we have to ask. All the days of my struggle, I will wait until my change comes, because your answer to that will answer everything else that comes together. Ultimately, everything comes down for the work of God's hands. If we are only here for a fleeting few decades and we're gone, and if we're just food for the worms and there's nothing beyond death, that has huge implications for the way we would then order our lives and function in this world. And it would be a very diminished capacity, as we'll see and discuss a little bit later. The implications of that are totally profound. And we would live in despair and without any hope. So the very one who gives hope and meaning and purpose, the idea of one who is the wellspring of truth, goodness, and beauty, the wellspring of all of life and so forth. Is it possible then for that one then to be reliable? Has he revealed himself? Can we trust him is the question we have. Or are we simply lost in the cosmos, floating around on our own in a very, very brief earthbound sojourn? So these are some of the questions that naturally will surface in our quest. We move into the second cycle of debate. And here we see Eliphaz's second speech in the second cycle. And this is in chapter 15. And so he argues that Job's mouth condemns him. And he says essentially that the wicked are suffering. And so again, as the debate goes on, as the cycles continue, there's more and more heat and less light, and there's more opposition, and they're not able to hear each other at all. So he's more accusatory than he was even in the first time. And then Job's response really constitutes chapters 16 and then 17. So we see his statement, which is at the end. So let's just go back to that text then and go to the beginning of chapter 16. And we'll see really at the very end of that where Eliphaz is saying essentially they conceive mischief and bring forth iniquity, and their mind prepares deception. And then Job answered. And so he then makes his appeal and in his case, and then makes this important statement that I'm jumping ahead to. Again, I'm being highly selective. Oh, that a man might plead with God as a man with his neighbor. So this is the point here, that my life is so short. Could I possibly plead with God? Could I interact with him? Could I understand his ways? Could I get him to understand my point of view? And he's treating God as if he were almost like a human that he could then somehow comprehend if God were to respond in the way that he's actually demanding. So we go back then to this material here, and we see that he calls his friends miserable comforters. He laments his situation. He defends his innocent. And then God makes Job a byword, is the imagery here in chapter 17. And so this idea of my spirit is broken and my days are extinguished. So there's a sadness. He increases in his sense of exile, of alienation, of an alienation and estrangement from the one he thought he knew and trusted. And so his grief is then overwhelming him, and so his emotions are beginning to tear away at his understandings that he had before in terms of his great appreciation for the living God and all that he's done in his fidelity. And then now he has to question and he has to wonder. He says, my plans are torn apart. The wishes of my heart. Nothing makes any sense for me. And so I'd be better off again saying that I would die. But where's my hope then? So we come down to the question of hope. Is there anything after this life? Shall we go down to Sheol, to the netherworld, and then simply perish? Is the question that he raises. And so we see in chapter 18 Bildad's second speech, and then in chapter 19 Job's response to Bildad. And so we see Bildad making the statement, and he speaks of the wicked, and again comes up with more and more bromides and platitudes rather than profound insights that goes on. But then Job has to defend himself. And in verse 23, after Bildad's diatribe here, and Job feels insulted, and so again going back to the outline here. So Bildad's speech, Job's response to Bildad, which is chapter 19. So we go back to chapter 19. And so Job's response. And how long will you torment me and crush me with words? And you've insulted me. And then the key theme in this chapter for me, the key verses, as again, since I'm just giving a survey, is of course verse 23 and following, which is one of the most incredible statements here about the idea of his Redeemer living. These are profound insights that transcend anything he could have known. He says, as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will take his stand on the earth. So it's an incredible statement. Ultimately, he's referring to Yeshua HaMashiach, the Messiah, even though he doesn't grasp what he's really saying, and yet he speaks the truth. He also recognizes something about the implications of that for his own life, his resurrection, that even after his skin is destroyed, after his body is gone, yet somehow he's going to be resurrected. From my flesh I will see God. So this is an implicit understanding of resurrected existence, which is very profound and very early. And as we know in the Scripture, there's a progress of revelation that takes place. And this is one of the most astonishing statements, because there's so little at this juncture about that concept of what happens after the grave. And so he says, whom I myself shall behold, and whom my eyes shall see, and not another. So his heart faints within him. He has this profound desire then to know God. So this is an extremely profound moment in the book of Job where he makes this declaration of insight. Then we have a second speech now. So we had Eliphaz, we had Bildad, now we had the second speech of Zophar, chapter 20, and then Job's response in chapter 21. So if we go to chapter 20, then here we have Zophar, and making his statements again, which are not very illuminating. But then we go to chapter 21 and Job's response and his answer. And again, Job is again trying to explain, to refute, to understand even in spite of this, he continues on, but he reflects upon the history and the lamp of the wicked, and so righteousness, and how ultimately the question is, who is the Almighty that we should serve him and that we should gain if we entreat him? He wonders then, if indeed the righteous are not blessed, then what's the purpose, he's almost implying, of trusting in God? So there's kind of a growing questioning, because he acknowledges, for example, no one can teach God knowledge. He's the one who judges on high. So nothing can be really defeat his plans. Yet he says, I know your thoughts, the plans by which you would wrong me, for you say, where is the house of the nobleman and the tent? So have you not asked the wayfaring man, what don't recognize a witness? For again, he's wrestling with the struggles of his life. And then we go to chapter 22, and then we have the third cycle of debate. So the third cycle of debate then is going to be in chapters 22 to 26. It's going to be Eliphaz and Bildad, but Zophar will not be included in that third round. So the Eliphaz's third speech then is in chapter 22, and so there we go and see him again accusing, and it gets again more accusatory, more offensive, more simplistic. Basically, it must be something you've done. Just confess your sin and reveal it and acknowledge it, and then you will do well. Then God will not harm you. So he says effectively, yield now and be at peace with him, and then good will come to you. And there's this instruction. He's saying, look, it's this simple. If there's pain, there must be unrighteousness. So basically, confess your sins, and then he's the one who will deal with you. So when you're cast down, you'll speak. The humble person he'll save. But he will deliver the one who's not innocent, and he'll be delivered through the cleanness of your hands. And so we have in chapter 22 then, Job's response to that. He argues that he longs for God, and that his complaint is rebellion again. And he goes on specifically in chapter 23 and verse 8 to say, I go forward, but he's not there. I backward, but I cannot perceive him. When he acts on the left, I cannot behold him. He turns on the right, I cannot see him. So he keeps on struggling with this. He says in verse 10, he knows the way I take. When he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. So he's still convinced of his righteousness. And indeed, remember that the text itself invited us to see that Job is a righteous man. And that's why he's struggling with the goodness of God, because there seems to be no justice. And this is the question then. Justice would mean then that the righteous are going to be blessed, and that the unrighteous will be punished. But it's not that simple, he's seeing. And so he's kept his way. He hasn't departed. He's treasured the words of his mouth. But who can turn him? So he then says, whatever he wants to do, I can't control. So he's dismayed at this whole process. And he goes on then to wrestle with this idea, and seems to say that God doesn't really acknowledge what's going on in this world. It seems to be that other things are unjust in this world. How can that be? And so he just gives a series of questions about why there seems to be an inconsistency in the world. The eye of the adulterer waits for the twilight. No one's going to see me. And they dig into houses. They shut themselves up by day. And so he says, essentially, that there is not a consistency in terms of righteousness and outcomes. The world is not consistent, and what can we cling to then? What can we depend upon? We go into chapter 25, and here we go back to our outline here. And what we've seen then is this third cycle of debate then. That's Bildad's third speech, and then Job's response to Bildad in chapter 26. So as we look at chapter 25 then, Bildad, very short little speech here, effectively in verse 4, how can a man be just with God? How can he be clean who is born of woman? Well, that insight's quite correct. And yet at the same time, he's accusing Job of saying, if you would just become just with God, then all would be well. If you just acknowledge your sin. So these thin solutions do not really have much subtlety, much reality, much depth. They don't stand against the struggles of this daily existence. So Job's response is a rebuke to Bildad. And in this chapter, he says in chapter 26 specifically, he stretches out the north over empty space and hangs the earth on nothing. Here's a man who has reflected on the greatness of God. And this is kind of an intimation of what's going to be taking place when God himself speaks to Job out of the whirlwind and says, who is this who answers and questions me with words without counsel, who wonders, if you don't understand the fringes of my ways, then how do you then are going to try to claim that you can bring me before the bar of your reasoning? Because he himself understands then things about the world. In fact, this is an interesting statement, that stretching out the north over empty space and hanging the earth on nothing, which would be very advanced concept in that time, that it's nothing that's specific. And of course, it's the gravity that he's referring to here, wraps the waters in the clouds and so forth. He obscures the face of the full moon. He's inscribed a circle in the surface of the waters, the boundary of light and darkness. And he says, effectively, looking at this, these are the fringes of his ways. And how faint a word we hear of him, but his mighty thunder, who can understand? So he speaks of this, and then he affirms his righteousness. So in a lengthy series here that we have, beginning in chapter 27, we have a kind of a monologue, two actual monologues. The first one's in chapters 27 to 28, in which he affirms his righteousness. And he says that man cannot discover wisdom. And so let's take a quick look at those, chapters 27 and 28. So in chapter 27 then, he continues his discourse. And he says effectively that I will hold fast my righteousness, and I will not let it go. My heart does not reproach any of my days. So he's saying, as far as I can see, in my own life and my dealings with my family, with my friends, with my wealth, with my attitude, with my worship, my service of the living God, I am not aware of anything that would possibly warrant this level of adversity and pain. So it raises this question of why, that there seems to be some fissure, some shattering in terms of his vision of the one he formerly had trusted implicitly, and with good reason. And this was Satan's objection then, of course. Does he serve you? Does he serve God without benefit? It's because of God's benefits that he serves. He wouldn't love God without those benefits, is what the accuser is saying. And so there's this deep inward and outward struggle that Job is encountering here. In chapter 28, we see that he speaks of the earth's treasure. And there we see that there's a mine for silver, a place where they refine gold and so forth. And he just looks, and he's a man who's really thought through the implications of this world and how we search and how we try to understand these things, but it really goes beyond our grasp. Even this imagery here of turning up things from under the earth, and it comes food, and then there's sapphires and gold. The path no bird of prey knows, nor has the falcon's eye caught sight of it. He speaks about his understanding and the things that are dark and hidden, and in the ground, in the bowels of the earth, and so forth. And so he meditates upon those themes, but then says, if the earth's treasures will not reveal all its wealth, even with diligent search, there's so much and so much mystery. How much then more difficult will it be to find wisdom? Where is the place of understanding? Where is it to be found? Where is it to be acquired? Where is it to be embraced? But then he adds in verse 23, God understands its way. He knows its place. He looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. And so this is a true and affirmable statement that God, the one who holds all things, who's made all things, and he controls all things. Even the idea of imparting weight to the wind, you see. The scientific implications of this book are intriguing to me, many implications. But then he goes on to say in verse 28, this wonderful summary, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil, that is understanding. And that's, of course, a primary motif in the wisdom literature. And so we see then in his first monologue that we can't discover wisdom. It's hidden. Only God has access to that, and we must turn to him for that. But it seems, though, that we can't really mine its depths. It's what he seems to be suggesting. And then he, in his second monologue, lengthy, in chapter 29, he remembers the past with fondness and kind of a remorse and a kind of a regret for those lost goods that he enjoyed. And then in the present, in chapter 30, he talks about his humiliation. And then in chapter 31, he is claiming to be innocent of sexual sins, of the abuse of power, of the abuse of wealth, of not caring for his enemies. And so then finally he ends up in 31 wanting to somehow meet with God and defend himself. And so in these chapters then we see this sequence. So going back to chapter 29 though for his second monologue, just to pull out a few highlights here. Just some themes I would call your attention to. So he basically reviews his past, and he, with a kind of longing and nostalgia for what that was. But in the present tense, then he's immersed then in pain and in adversity. And so he reviews that. And again, the poetry is rich and beautiful and profound in this book. The poetry speaks it's more than the rational realm, it's also the emotional realm, it's the realm of imagination, of aspiration, and so forth. So he says, my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have seized me. And then in chapter 31, he speaks about this integrity again, that I've made a covenant with my eyes. I couldn't gaze at a virgin. So he's speaking again from the fact that he is seeking to walk with integrity and not in iniquity. This is a major theme in his life. And so he puts all these things together, and he says, if I've despised these things, if I've done anything wrong, effectively, he's looking at all the themes and the motifs of his life. But he says, if I've done anything these wrongs, then that would be show it to me, and I will acknowledge it. But he says, I am innocent. And so he says, the calamity from God's a terror to me. Because of his majesty, I can't do anything. And so he speaks about this. If I had done something wrong, if I had denied my God, if I had rejoiced at the extinction of my enemy, if I had treated the alien and the poor improperly, then there would be something. But here, he says, there's nothing that makes any sense. Oh, he cries, that I had one to hear me. Here's my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. The indictment which my adversity has written, surely I carry it on my shoulder. I'd bind it to myself like a crown. And so he basically says, if I've done any of these things, then let me be torn up. But as it is not so. I hold to my defense. And so then we move into a major change in the book of Job when we come to the solution of Elihu. And this is the younger man who chose not to enter into the debate out of deference for his elders, but now he chooses to intervene. And there's a section then in chapters 32 to 37 in which he makes these very clear rebuttals, and he challenges Job to debate, and he even quotes Job's complaints in chapter 33. And so it's intriguing then how he challenges him to debate again, and then he answers him. So then a third rebuttal. So he gives these conclusions. We don't have a response by Job because it's God who's the one who ends the whole debate. But he draws this conclusion that God is disciplining Job, and he reminds him of the greatness of God. So his counsel is a lot better. It's a lot wiser, more consistent, more realistic, that he's not simply saying that Job has done something sinful, but rather that Job needs to reflect upon his need to trust in God, even though he does not understand him. And so going back to that text then, and just a few highlights just from that. So they ceased answering Job, and it does specifically say he was righteous in his own eyes. And so that's a statement that will need that, it's a component of repentance that's necessary, because he had justified himself and felt that justice is on his side, and therefore if it doesn't make sense to him, then God must be the one who's wrong. He won't quite say it that way, but that's what it implies. But so he said, it's time for me, even though I'm young, I deferred, but now I need to teach. And so he speaks to this, and he listened to his reasons. I paid close attention. No one refuted you. So here he says, it's necessary for me to speak. He says in verse 8, by the way, it is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives them understanding. And so he speaks of this as really a basis for his arguments. And he claims effectively to reveal God's insights and conveys these principles, which are a great deal more nuanced and accurate than those of Job's friends. And in verse 28, he says, "He has redeemed my soul from going to the pit. Behold, God does all these oftentimes with man, to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be enlightened with the life of life." In other words, he's saying maybe there is, in fact, some restorative, redemptive dimension to this that's not just directly associated with flat-out sin, that you're being punished, but actually some process to enlighten him, to give him wisdom, to give him understanding, because it's through that pain and adversity that one can grow. He goes on to say in chapter 34 and in verse 9, profits a man nothing when he's pleased with God. He's again accusing Job of making these statements. "Therefore listen to me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God to do wickedness, and from the Almighty to do wrong. He pays a man according to his work, makes him find it according to his way." He's not going to act wickedly. He's not going to pervert justice. Who gave him authority over the earth? Who has laid on him the whole world? So again, this is closer to what God himself is going to be saying. If he should determine to do so, if he should gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together. Man would return to death. Do you not realize that he's holding all things together, and that ultimately then you have to be completely dependent on his good disposition? And so he speaks as well. His eyes are upon the ways of a man. He sees all his steps. He says that there is no darkness or deep shadow where the workers of iniquity may hide themselves, you see. And so he has insight then. He has no need to consider a man further. So he then continues in this long and lengthy argument here and gets sharper in his reproofs of Job. And then we finally get to the end of his statements here in chapter 37, and particularly verse 13 is a text I want to call. "Surely God will not listen to an empty cry, nor will the Almighty disregard it." It's the whole concept then is that God is in control, and he knows what he is accomplishing. What he is seeking to achieve is something that is more profound than we could actually ever imagine. So in continuing on into chapter 37, that he expresses then the power of the living God, and stand and consider the wonders of God and so forth. So he begins to ask questions, again, the kind of questions that God himself is going to ask. Consider the wonders. Do you know how God establishes them and makes the lightning of his cloud to shine? It's precisely the question that God's going to ask him. The wonders of one who is perfect in knowledge. So he then says, can you do any of these things? And can you therefore rearrange anything in nature to change it in a way that God could actually create life and take away life? We don't have that power. God's awesome in his majesty. We cannot find him. And so we see that whether for correction or for his world or for loving kindness, he causes all things to happen. And so out of the north comes golden splendor, as he says. Around God is awesome majesty. The Almighty, we cannot find him. He is exalted in power. And he will not do violence to justice and abundant righteousness. In other words, you cannot impute Wrong. He is the wellspring of truth, goodness, and beauty. He says, therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise in heart. So this really summarizes, instead of having Job's possible response to that, as I say, at this juncture, it's God who is the one who breaks the silence and opens up the whole new realm of what's taking place in chapter 38. Now God speaks to Job. Let's go back to our image then as we kind of work our way through this material then. So we saw the 3 rounds of debate, and then after this, and we observed then the first the round, the second, and then the third, in which Zophar was silent. And you act as my judge, the Lord's my judge, the Lord's my refuge. And then the basic complaints, as we observed before, it seems that God doesn't hear me. He says God seems to be punishing me in an unjust way. Yet he allows the wicked to prosper. So why would he then, it seems, turn against the righteous and allow the unrighteous to flourish? It doesn't seem that the world is right or just or proper. And so when we go to these themes then, that's when we saw the final discourse and defense of Job, followed by Elisha's solution. And again, to summarize these 4, we had Eliphaz was more of a theologian, and Bildad more of a historian or a legalist. Zophar is a moralist or a dogmatist, whereas Elihu is a young theologian, more of an intellectual. Eliphaz relies more on observation and experience, and whereas Bildad relies on tradition, and Zophar on assumption and education. And then we have, finally, personality, considerate, argumentative, rude, and blunt. And there's a little bit of conceit, it would seem, in Elihu's statements, but he's more perceptive than the others were. And we have the different kinds of voices, the voice of philosophy versus the voice of history, that of orthodoxy, this is the way you are to think, and then more of a voice of logic. And Eliphaz effectively saying, if you sin, you're going to suffer. And Bildad, you must be sinning. Zophar is more bold and say you are sinning. And then we have God purifies and teaches so that it's more greater clarity that takes place. Only the wicked suffer, according to Eliphaz. The wicked always suffer. The wicked are short-lived. But the humble are those who submit to God. And he's inviting him to humble yourself and submit to God. That's much better counsel than the others provided. So this gives us very richer insight of what's taking place. So with Eliphaz, God is more of a punisher of the wicked, and he's the immovable lawgiver under Bildad, unbending and merciless in Zophar. You can again see their personalities. And with Elihu, he's really a disciplinarian. He's a teacher. He's training you, you see. And this is a richer, I think, understanding. And the names of the 4 men are also insightful because, you see, we move from God is gold to God, to the son of contention, to a chirper, which is Zophar more like that, and then he is my God. And so moving back to our overview of Job then, we see the final section of the book dealing with the deliverance of Job in chapters 38 to 42. And so after Elihu's preparatory discourse, God himself ends the debate. And he speaks to Job from the whirlwind. In his first speech, then, he revealed his power and wisdom as creator and preserver. Job responded by acknowledging his own ignorance and insignificance. I can't do anything. I can't rebut. I have no opportunity. And then God reveals, and he speaks to Job about his sovereign authority and challenges Job with illustrations of his power to control the uncontrollable. So let's take a quick look at some of those texts as well, so that we move then to God's manifestation, and ultimately then it's going to be followed by the deliverance of Job. So going back to our text then, God now speaks to Job. And he asks this fundamental question: who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? So the debate is ended, and instead it's the one about whom the debate, the one that they've been appealing to and referring to. He's the one who manifests himself, but in a palpable way that is so profound that Job is overwhelmed. And so he asks him this question: gird up your loins like a man. Here, get yourself ready. I'll ask you. You tell me, where were you when I laid the foundation of the world? So at that first question then, of course, Job has no answer. I wasn't there. Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? What were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? And it's an image of the angels who were rejoicing as they watched God's creation being brought into being. So that the angels themselves, the host of heaven, were with him as he creates the heavens and the earth in some profound way. They sang together. It's like a song. He speaks it and sings it into being. C.S. Lewis does that in his Magician's Nephew, when Aslan basically sings the world into being. He enclosed the sea with doors and so forth. He gives this this perspective here. He bursting forth, it went forth from this womb. So he looks at various aspects about his own power and manifests himself. Have you ever in your life commanded the morning, caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it? It's changed like clay under the seal. So what is he doing then? He's raising questions about the various aspects of under the earth and the sea and the stars. And so, again, he asks him, you were born then, the number of your days is great. No, you don't know these things. You can't understand the visible world, the physical world. Then how could you possibly understand the one who made it all and holds it all together? And so he asks him this question when he says, can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? So he's looking at the constellations. Can you lead it in its season and guide the bear with her satellites? Who can count the clouds? He describes this in verse 36. And he's put wisdom in the innermost being, given understanding to the mind. And so these are profound questions that he raises about the various aspects of the natural world, mysterious things that we can hardly begin to understand, about the lions. And he takes pleasure in describing the nature and the beings that are found in his created order. And so we see God's discourse and looking at the flora and the fauna, the workings of his hands. He looks at various creatures and takes pleasure in describing the wild ox and so forth, the ostrich's wings, even though they don't seem to be much by way of taking care of their young. Yet she has a power, and though her labor be in vain, she's unconcerned. So some of my creatures are very different from one another, but some have not got a share of understanding. It's an amazing thing that God's actually describing the things that he's called into being. And when the ostrich laughs at the horse and the rider, then he looks with pleasure about the glory and majesty of the horses that he has created. And again, he speaks about the glory of the birds and the hawk stretching its wings as it's riding on the thermal, and the eagle mounting up, making his nest on high upon the rocky crag. He spies out food. He sees it from afar. And there he says, this is my created order. Now Job's response, and that's where we're going to pick up next time, is going to be, how does he respond? And he says effectively, what can I say? Will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it. And so Job's answer, and this is where we'll stop here and pick up next time, I'm insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I spoke too much. Once I have spoken, I will not answer. Even twice I'll add nothing more. But that's not what God's looking for. And that is why there's a second series of questions that God's going to give him And he's going to continue to ask him more questions until Job will properly respond. And so he will then question him a second time and ask him and point out various things he's created and then draw conclusions. And then the response of Job will be that of repentance, not just humbling himself, but actually acknowledging that he spoke things that were improper to speak because he was trying to bring God before the court of his own understanding and reason. So therefore, we have to see, as we explore this book, that it's raising fundamental questions about life itself, about the questions about purpose, about meaning, about hope, about justice, and things that we know are so. How is it possible then, if this world is so elegant and extraordinary, how is it possible then that the one who made it all could be possibly construed as unrighteous? There's something wrong with my apprehension. And so there's a clear need for us to repent and to move away from the arrogance of autonomy and to recognize that only when we submit and surrender and understand He is one who can be trusted, though not understood, that we do find the comfort of the Father's house. And that's what life's meant to be.